Hi BookTube, and welcome to a new video. This was supposed to be a Friday reads, but couldn't get to do it on Friday, but it does have the compensation of I completed another book to add to this. So it's 4 books in all. Percival Everett, The Trees, Neil Bartlett's new book, Address Book, Charlene Elsby, Psychrows, and Kobo Abe, The Ruined Map. So I'm going to start with Percival Everett's The Trees, and I will just say that I was alerted to this book's existence. It was published this year, although Percival Everett is an author I'm very familiar with, but I didn't know this had come out. I was alerted to this by watching the excellent review of Travel Through Stories, which I am going to place the link to, and I suggest you check his out because there's not a lot that I can add to this. 5-star read for me. Very different Percival Everett sort of book, because a lot of the 4 of the 5 Percival Everett books I've read before are quite postmodern. This isn't. This is a rollicking, fast-paced, sort of detective thriller, although it's not really a genre book. It's just how it's framed to sort of lure you in and seduce you. And its pace is unrelenting. I mean, it's a really quick read for me. Because of the pace. They're very short chapters, sort of 2-3 pages. And it starts off, we are in a town called Money, Mississippi, where in short order 2 white men are found dead with barbed wire wrapped around their necks, and their body is pretty desecrated, including castration. And a black corpse is also in the vicinity, holding on to the aforementioned male genitalia, which obviously has police baffled. More so when after the first crime, and they take both bodies into the local morgue, and they're in the sort of refrigerator drawers or whatever, and it turns out that the black body disappears. The white one's still there, but the black body has disappeared. Even more troubling when at the scene of the second murder in the town, that very same black body is there. So the Mississippi Bureau of Investigations are called in, which had to be in the form of 2 Afro-American detectives. And then what starts happening around the country is there are similar versions, not with the same black body, it has to be said, with different ones. And this is all very troubling. And the FBI called in, and an FBI Afro-American female agent works with the 2 MBI agents in Money, Mississippi. And pretty quickly, we see that one of the puzzling things about the Afro-American corpse was it's a lot more dead than the recent white corpses. That it seems to have been dead for a lot longer. It also appears to be Emmett Till, which was an infamous case in Money, Mississippi, of a lynching of a young boy, because supposedly he looked at a white woman and she complained to her friends and family, and they caught up with the boy and lynched him, and that she later recanted that had ever happened. And it so happens that that woman, now a sort of elderly, venerable grandmother, is the mother of one of the dead white victims. So there seems to be a link to the Emmett Till case. And what you realise is that this is a very, very ingenious satire on the history of racial abuse and assault that mainly took the form of lynchings, but was now mutated into police murders of Afro-Americans. That it's an ongoing, never-ending process. There is a character in here called Mama Z, who has collated and recorded every single case of lynching throughout the history of America that she could find, and documented, the court transcripts where the perpetrators were even taken to court. Detailed as much information as she could get. And the MIB officers and the FBI officer begin to suspect that she's somehow tied in with this. Obviously, she can't commit the murders because she's 105 years old, but that somehow she's fueling this. And as I say, it's really a sort of a satire and a commentary on the state of race relations in America, that America can never move on until it faces up and confronts this history. And in a way that the plot in this book, with all these sort of racial tinged murders, is almost as if history is trying to force America to confront the history that it denies. And also, and as Travels Through Stories points out, what could be more, poignant a symbol, or loaded a symbol, as a black man having castrated a white man and holding his testicles, both as a sign of sort of emasculation, but also, of course, of the trope of, the greater size of black genitalia over white. So it's really quite powerful, hitting you, below the belt and in the face at the same time. It's quite funny. There's lots of cheesy lines. The white hillbillies are sort of lacerated in how Everett writes them. There's lots of sort of, cop buddy sort of humour as well. It's just an all-round very, very good book. 5 stars. And on to Neil Bartlett, Address Book. So I've read pretty much all the fiction Neil Bartlett has written. He's also adapted plays, because his main activity is actually as a theatre director. And I've seen a couple of his plays, but obviously I mainly relate to him as a fiction writer. And this is his latest after quite a long hiatus. It's short stories, and it starts off with a brilliant conceit, which I don't think is really sustained throughout the rest of the book, whereby a guy in lockdown is just leafing through an old address book of his and finds this scribbled address on a piece of paper inserted into the address book, which I thought was going to carry on throughout, but it's not the case. But no big deal. And he casts his mind back to the significance of that address, where he was a teenage boy. I would say that all the stories in here are queer stories, and that Bartlett himself is a gay man. And the boy, as a teenager, had sort of anonymous sex in toilets and things like that. But this was the address of the first man that he had a proper loving relationship with, who was an older man. He was 29 and he was a teenager. And the teenager had to travel from the sticks into London to travel to this guy's address. And that's the address that's written on the piece of paper. And, it's a big deal. It's a big deal for the boy. As I say, he's only had up to that point anonymous sex with strangers. This is something altogether, and he has to sort of steel himself to take the trip for the first time. Everything is quiet, and I'm 15. When I get to the ticket hall, the tiles of the floor are all still wet and shining. I'm clearly going to be the first person to walk across them this morning, and I stop for a moment to gather my nerve. While I stand there in the doorway, I can hear myself starting to mutter something under my breath. Andrew, I seem to be saying. My name is Andrew. I sound like I'm trying to convince myself of something. Or maybe I sound like an anaesthetist does in the ICU when they lean forward and ask you to please start counting backwards from 20 when they want you to let go. So he's almost like steeling himself to let go, to fall into this. So it's a beautiful story about first love, first gay love. And it has a sort of a poignant, 20 years down the line when they still have a friendship and everything. It has a poignant ending. Then we have a story about, which I think sort of hints back to Bartlett's brilliant historical study of the times of Oscar Wilde, called Who Was That Man?, which I reread earlier this year, where that's a non-fiction book where Bartlett is musing on Oscar Wilde's London of the 1890s, with Bartlett's own in the 1980s London, which is a time of AIDS and increased prejudice and bigotry against gays. It's a fantastic book, and the story in here took me straight back into that world, although it's not strictly in a Wildean London. It's about a guy who moves down to London from the Midlands, lands a job in a Catholic school as a teacher, and has been given the task of making a banner for an important saint's holiday, and hits upon the idea of this beautiful boy that he's seen, who's not in his school, who's not underage, but he saw him on the he saw him when this boy, this sort of young lad, brought his younger relative into the guy's class because the kid had been cut in class. That's where he first laid eyes on him and fell in love with him. Then he goes seeking him out and manages to locate him. And he's always covered in white because he works in plaster of Paris. It's a fantastic image. So he decides that he's going to try and persuade this boy and persuade the school to let the boy be a model for this banner for the saint in armour. And it's very much about sort of heroic masculinity. And it's just brilliantly written about the tension of, are they going to consummate, their love or not, or is it forever going to almost remain like a muse, I suppose, or an artist sitter? It's a fantastic, fabulous story. Then there's another story about set in the 60s, where a woman, the married wife who's at home all day, every Wednesday she sees this guy going into one of the other flats who she's never seen the occupant of that flat. She knows he's a man, but she's never seen him. And the guy who arrives always carries a record under his arm. And when he goes into the flat, he puts the record on full blast, and it's the same record every time. It's all very intriguing, although I did work out quite quickly what that was about. And it's actually quite a tender story about how she realises what's going on in that flat. And it's not hostile or sinister. It's something that she actually comes to feel quite tender and warm about. It's a really beautifully done story in the fashion that Bartlett has. So it's a really solid collection until the last story. I think it's the last story. There's no content. So basically, a guy in his 50s, his lover has died from a heart attack, long-time partner has died in a heart attack, and he's grieving. And this sort of empty, abandoned house sort of calls to him in his grief. He's almost hallucinating that it's the voice of maybe his lover or something. But he's drawn to this house and he breaks in and he sort of tidies it up a bit, but he doesn't bring anything into it. And then on a shopping expedition, which he used to do religiously every Saturday with his partner, now is doing it on his own and is struggling really to keep it together to do this. Anyway, he meets a guy, and there's a bit of a sort of flicker of attraction between the two of them. And he takes him into this abandoned house, and they have, really, really nice sex. Now, that whole part of the grieving and the meeting this guy and everything, I found beautifully done. But the whole thing about the abandoned house and why it had to be there and not in his house, I struggled with that. I couldn't quite see what the point of that was. And as beautiful as the thing I'd read out about the anaesthetist, we also have some quite, well, not some, but a bit of ugly language, which I don't associate with Bartlett. So he's talking about the drawer of this strange house. And then the next Monday evening, I retraced my steps. That's right, like a dog to his vomit. So I was a bit surprised, a bit taken aback by that. But on the whole, this shows all of Bartlett's skill in writing warm and tender and real, relationships that feel real. He just hits the sweet spot emotionally of, forcing you to react emotionally as a reader. 4.5 stars. And talking of 4.5 stars, this is Charlene Elsby's Psycrows. This is the second Elsby novel I've read, both on the recommendation of Fraser Simons over at Springboard for Thought. And what a roller coaster this book turned out to be. So a woman's partner has committed suicide and she's trying to come to terms with that. I think there's part of this book which is a dialogue with Camus' thoughts on suicide, because the way Camus treated it is that suicide isn't an isolated act. It reflects back on everything in life. And that as an existentialist, Camus asked the question, if life is so absurd and meaningless, why wouldn't you commit suicide? Suicide is the only logical step. And I think this book is partly in dialogue with that. And one of the ways that she bursts out of her situation, really, is she starts having anonymous sex with men, partly, as she says, to push through the membrane, because her lover recently died. He's still there in her psyche, and it's as if by having sex with this man, it's like, okay, she would definitely realise that he's gone forever, he's not coming back. That's what she means by pushing him through the membrane. But on the other side, she also wonders about her own culpability in her lover's death, that she didn't see the signs, that she wasn't able to be enough to save him from checking out of the earth, and things like that, and that she's sort of punishing herself again by this anonymous sex. And by about a third of the way in, there's a hilarious scene of sex in a Starbucks bathroom with a complete stranger. I found it very funny. Blowjob scenes can be pretty hackneyed, but I found this sort of vivid and fresh, and as I say, funny. But then it turns very dark in a way that caught me completely. Well, I say it caught me completely, on the hop. It shouldn't have, because I've read her previous novel Affect, and that's pretty dark. It's the journey up to that point, including through the dark side. So about the first 2/3 of the book were fantastic. I was really swept along, but kept off balance. It was vertiginous. It was, there's again sort of philosophical questions about life and death. What does death mean? What does death look like? What is life? What is life for? And purposefulness. There's a lot of stuff about gender, interestingly, about different treatment of thought in men and women, and that's particularly poignant today because in the UK the government have launched an inquiry into whether the whole history of medical testing has been absolutely biased towards Caucasian males, which is why that non-Caucasian and women were so hard hit by the COVID virus, in the sense of more proportionally a lot more of them died. These are very real issues, but the reason I took, I was sort of wavering between 4 or 5 star all the way through this read. But again, like Affect, I felt she didn't land it at all. It sort of just ran out of energy, just sort of drifted. I didn't find the ending satisfactory, which knocked it down to a 4.5 star, but still a great read. In a way, I actually preferred this to Affect, even though the sort of philosophical inquiry of Affect I found more pertinent and more directly to my interest than this one. But actually this is a better novel, I think, and this is her latest, so it shows a development, I think, in her writing, because she's only published 3 novels and she was by trade a philosopher. So to make that leap from concept heavy, maybe dry philosophy to, no, this is sort of fiction that arouses emotions and things like that, pretty impressive. And finally, on to what I am told is a modern classic. I'm told by Penguin, because it is in the modern classic series. It's from Japan. It's translated by E. Dale Saunders. It's a detective story, or a private eye story, whereby a woman's husband has disappeared, and the woman's brother is the one who calls in a private investigator. The only clue is a box of matches, or a matchbook rather, from a nearby cafe that's in the guy's raincoat that he's left behind. And the best thing about this book is, from that one single clue, how the private eye extends and finds sort of other clues that it leads to, which was really impressively done, I thought, actually. From one single clue, you get this whole concatenation of ideas and associations and stuff. That was the good side of this book. The bad side of this book is the treatment of women. Because apart from the woman whose husband has disappeared, who's sort of portrayed, I think, in quite a stereotypical, cliche, Japanese, enigmatic way, all the other women in this book are sex objects. Or not sex objects, but they're objectified as if the PI wants to have sex with them. And it got very tiresome very quickly. The other thing is that the brother, it turns out that he's a bit of a shady character. He's perpetually sort of stalking almost this PI, It keeps bumping into each other and sort of feeding him tidbits about sort of the structure of Japanese life and community that the disappeared guy may or may not have been involved with. And at that point early on, I thought, okay, this is going to be interesting because this was written in the late 50s. I don't know Japanese history, but I'm assuming the point between the post-war difficulties of Japan and its entry into its sort of modern late 20th century world of salaried men, you know, who worked all hours and every hour, so that, you know, they rose to the top and all that, and also Yakuza. Now, I know Yakuza have probably been around, they're Japanese gangsters. I know they've probably been around before the late 50s, but it seemed that's when they came more into prominence, or at least more into the public psyche. So I thought this shady guy sort of represented the Yakuza, and the missing guy was going to represent the salary man. But actually, that didn't seem to be the case. So I was a bit disappointed in that, which may say more about me and my expectations than the writing. But without that, I didn't feel that I was getting much understanding of the social milieu of which this book takes place, and it was entirely predictable which direction it was going to go, and I just didn't like it. 2.5 stars. And as to what I'm currently reading, so my third non-fiction November title is The Grammar of Rock, by Art and Artlessness in 20th Century Pop Lyrics by the novelist Alexander Theroux. And this is slow going. It's quite dense, but it's also a bit structureless, and the print is very small. And Anna Burns's second novel called Little Constructions. I'm reading that. So there you have it. Thanks very much. Till next time.